Okay, so we're just picking up where we left off earlier. This is part 2 of the walkthrough for LabAssignment01. And so we have the base JPEG or bitmap image scaled and rotated correctly, oriented correctly in our model space. So now what we have to think about is basically how to draw all of these lines, right? Now you may be tempted to just start drawing lines, but organizationally, what you actually want to think about first is how many types of line weights do you want to use in this drawing. And because of that, I would actually start out with the layer properties manager up here and basically think about, okay, well, if I'm looking at this drawing, I'll probably need maybe 3 to 4 line weights. And so you'll probably have to create, eventually create 3 to 5 layers. One layer for, some hatches. But basically that's probably the amount of layers that you'll need for this particular section. Now these sort of layers actually really will get, you'll eventually get ones where that are very, very, have hundreds of layers, right? But for now, let's try to keep things simple. So I'll make basically a couple, just like type and click on the new layer button right there. I'll make 3 or 4 new layers, and I'll just sort of name them. So the first one I'll name them is the cut layer. Usually this is the sort of cutting plane, or all of the objects or the material that's being cut through by your section plane. So this is often done in red because it usually means the structure. And then behind that, you can have a couple other layers that are, a little bit either seen, lighter, and essentially you're going from thick and dark to lighter and lighter. So some people just number them, 1, 2, 3, 4. Some people like go, thick, thin, blah, blah, blah. So let's just do thick, oops. Medium and thin. Okay, so I'm red, maybe actually pick one of the cardinal colors, green, and then blue. Okay, so now we have these, we have an idea of what we're starting with, and I'm actually going to just, but while we're here, I'm going to double click on the cut line layer to make it active, and you'll see the sort of little green checkbox there. Okay, so now we're drawing with the cut line layer. Now earlier, when I was drawing, I was actually using the line command, right? When you start doing some of these, you'll actually have to look at some situations where you actually might want to use the polyline command. Or up here, you'll see things like the rectangle, the boxes, things like that. You'll have to kind of use a variety or a mixture of these tools. So for example, I can use the rectangle command there and try to zoom in. And when you see something like this, your sort of first intuition might be actually to kind of try to trace it, but these lines are really, really easy to edit eventually. So for example, I'm just going to use the rectangle command to basically roughly block out this rectangle here. Now don't worry about these things not lining up. They will not line up perfectly, so you'll have to interpret things a little bit. Now this looks like it's a sort of sliding door of some sort. But the line of the real sort of stronger cut line is actually diving down here, and these things actually are sort of aligning with everything that's sort of going upwards, right? And so you can draw these in isolation, although sometimes what I like to do is actually kind of look at these and maybe say, well, if these lines are supposed to be all aligned, then I'll just draw one sort of longer vertical line like this and have that actually be a sort of reference line that we can use to position things later on. So I can highlight that and then type CO for copy and just sort of copy this a certain distance to the right. And remember that like while you're sort of pulling this with the polar tracking behavior in a certain distance, you can actually see roughly how far this is, right? Now this makes sense because this is probably roughly an 8-inch wall, so I'll just put an 8-inch distance into it, right? And so when you're sort of actually tracing these, you're not necessarily just arbitrarily using the measurements, but you're actually trying to rationalize parts of the section into thicknesses that actually kind of make sense, right? So that's one of the things that's sort of really important here. Now don't worry about these lines. These are things that are that can be easily cleaned up later. So I'm sort of kind of showing you some of the techniques I use or we use to kind of make sure that things line up properly. Things that are supposed to line up want to line up properly. So now down here you have this sort of intersection. When I'm using the line command, one of the other techniques I use is actually this, where I start the line command, I hover over an intersection to kind of put down the intersection marker, and then I drag it in the direction of something. And this creates a sort of, you can actually let the starting point of your line be at this sort of offset distance, okay? So in this case, I'm just sort of gonna guess, let's see, 1 foot, 2 inches. So 14 inches, for example, right? Oops, wrong direction. So you can actually do something like that, and then use this, for example, to trim TR off the bottom of these longer lines that we had. And then use this, and I'm just sort of boundary selecting them to trim off the center portion of that. So you'll see that now we have this situation. And then you can leave that be for now, because then all the rest of these, will kind of build in into the rest of the drawing. So you can actually just, in some cases, basically trace and try to kind of fill out, the rest of the drawing. There are some locations where you're free to kind of make your own interpretations as to what the dimensions really should be, how far, how long they want to go. But really keep in mind that you probably want to keep the sort of polar tracking active in most cases as you go along. And there are some dimensions like this where it actually makes sense that this dimension actually want to be aligned. So you can actually drag and have the extensions track to each other, so you know that eventually this will line up, right? That's another 4-inch wall. And basically reconstruct the drawing from here there. Now, there's no need to, at least at this stage, you don't really have to be too overly obsessive about everything lining up, because these are things that eventually you can, easily modify. Okay, so you'll see that this is the way you would basically kind of construct the parts of the building that are within the section cut. Now there are some other trickier parts here. For example, let's say this sort of angled portion. Whoops. You kind of want to avoid this sort of mistake I just did. So I'm just Control Z to undoing it. But sometimes using the sort of polar tracking option, you might accidentally shift it at the last moment when you're clicking. So make sure that you don't make that mistake. And for example, this angle, I would do this, and then basically try to angle it. And now you can actually try to line it up as a crossing, but sometimes that might be harder to do. And so often what I'll do is actually do this, draw it like this, leave a little gap in between, and then use the extend command, EX, choose the boundary line that you need to extend to, enter, and then click the line segment that you want to extend, and that will actually do that. And then you can use this to basically trim it off. Now this is actually a sort of rounded corner, which is called a fillet. The fillet you can find somewhere up here, I believe, this. Or you can just type the command fillet, as in fish fillet. And so it will ask you to give it a radius, select the first object, second object. There should be a default radius applied, so you can see down here the default radius is actually 0. So we will have to click on the radius option and just kind of let's just give it a guess, right? Let's see 1 foot and see what we get. And so you click the first segment, second segment, okay, and you look at that and that's a little too small, right? So let's undo that. Control Z, Control Z. Fillet. Whoops. Oh, I keep on typing the wrong thing. Radius, let's see 2 feet this time, right? And then click the first line segment, second line segment. Okay, now that looks a little better, but maybe not quite there yet. So otherwise you can actually just delete this as well and then run the actually I'll just click here. Run the command again. Radius, let's see, let's try 2 feet and 6 inches. Click on the line segments. Okay, now that fits a lot better, right? So there's a little bit of trial and error here, basically as far as getting a handle over what that radius really wants to be. And that goes the same for these corners. All these sort of rounded corners are ones that basically, essentially, if you have the set of perpendicular lines, and I'm sort of winging this because I'm just sort of showing you this right now, you can use the fillet command, get a sense of, okay, so 2 and 6 actually might be a little bit too much, so you will kind of want to dial that back a tiny little bit. So undo it, run it again, do the radius, and this time let's do 2 feet, 3 inches. And try that. Okay, that fits a little bit better. Okay, so you can actually very easily sort of start to sketch out a lot of the elements in here. And for example, this, I was drawing this using the cut sort of layer, but it's easy to kind of just select it. Whoops, click the wrong thing. Select this, select these objects and basically change them over. Let's say, for example, in this case, this is probably a medium sort of a layer. Shows up as a medium line weight layer. Now the other part of this is that you can actually, within the layer manager, come in here, and while line weight is actually a much more complicated issue, at first, for now, we can actually just like rudimentarily apply some line weights to this. So for example, the cut line weight, you can double click here. Instead of the default, let's give it a 0.3 millimeter thickness. The green sort of medium line weight, double click on it, and then give it, let's say, 0.18. The thick magenta line weight, give it a 0.25, and then the thin, give it 0.09. And this is just completely arbitrary, right? You can sort of mess around and experiment with that a little bit. But what this does, right now it's not showing up, so you have to go down to the lower left here. There's this little icon on the taskbar that says ShowHide line weight. If you enable and click it, you'll see that, for example, that red cut line that's a little thicker, this actually starts to show a different thickness than the green. Okay, so this is just a display mode. You can toggle it on or off, but you can clearly see, the sort of difference that the line weights and how the line weights kind of display. So basically, you kind of just go through, and for some of the elements, like I'm switching my layer to the thin layer, And for example, these are, windows or elements that you kind of see. And the thing about this is that, okay, you look at these three windows and you see, well, these actually probably want to be the same size, right? And so you can basically just draw one of them and copy them downwards, sort of like that. Okay. So I showed you using the trim, using the extend in situations like this. Now, one of the things that you'll note actually is that sometimes when you kind of have been drawing things and you operate on things a little bit, they will sometimes get obscured or hidden by this the sort of base image. So what you actually do, and I'm sorry, I just kind of did it there, is you kind of type the regenerate command, and it should bring things up to where you can see them. If that's somewhat of an issue, sometimes basically the draw order gets messed up. Okay. So in this case, for example, then to kind of finish that out a little bit, or the sort of larger boundary. Let's just kind of go through really quickly. And just sort of very roughly, I'm just sort of really roughly kind of tracing out parts of the design that I think should be like this. Now obviously you can kind of take a little bit more of your time trying to make sure things line up. And I'm just really winging this. Okay. So in this case, for example, I want to take out these two, so you can actually just select those line segments and use the TR trim command to take that out, right? So now you have the sort of more closed framework. Then you can draw in, the rest of these lines. Depends, sometimes I'm lazy. I just draw them first and then, switch their layer affiliation afterwards, but sometimes it's a better idea to do that beforehand, right? So it's a mixture of basically fleshing things out, changing the layers, and slowly constructing the drawing to where it should be. Now some of these elements you see, this is a really blurry part of it, right? But basically that's a sort of circle. So you can use the circle command right there, and this is very blurry, so just give it your best sort of guess and guesstimate. Right? Now, not everything in here has to be perfect, right? There's a certain level of interpretation that's involved with this in particular, but that's basically some of the basics that you need. For all these sort of filleted corners, basically draw the straight lines and the angles and use the fillet command to kind of round out the corners. All of these are very simple straight lines. There are some cases like this, for example, with a crossing. If you want to kind of take care of all of these crossings together, you can actually select them all together, use the trim command, and then trim out what's left. Like that, right? So it's really easy to edit these things. Obviously, you can still use the grips if you want to. I usually don't, but you can actually use the grips and edit the lengths directly, like that. And kind of notice that I'm actually starting or trying to use the snap behavior, especially when I'm editing something like that. Okay. And then in situations like this, sometimes I don't care. I'll just like overshoot it and edit it afterwards. And just so then you can take that line and then just trim it. And then you can use this to trim out the middle part, right? And so it's relatively easy to construct those. Now obviously, you know, there are some dimensions, for example, here to here and here to here, where when you're looking at the structure, you actually want these dimensions to be the same. So in those cases, you know, take a little time, you know, try to kind of construct it correctly. Otherwise, you can always move them after the fact. Okay, so I think these are just like the basic fundamentals, and just to kind of give you an idea of what that drawing should look like in the end, eventually constructed. This is a pretty good example. If you look at the layers, this has a lot more, you know, layers, the background cut elements, details, hatch, the hill, interior wall elements near opening railing. So, you know, this person actually, you know, had a lot of different categories applied, and you can see all the different line weights that she applied. But this kind of gives you an idea of, you know, what the drawing should look like in the end. There's some issues with the hatches, but for now, for this sort of stage, don't worry about the hatches and the fills or the line weights too much yet. That's something we'll get into in the next session. So for now, I'll, whoops, it's not showing up. For now, just kind of worry about, you know, getting the lines in place and getting at least, you know, 3 or 4 different line weight layers going, and then we'll pick up the rest of these other issues, especially in terms of plotting and line weights and the hatch and the fills, in the next lab session. All right?